Do you feel like you hate being told what to do? I know nobody loves it, but do you hate it? Does it affect you? Does it upset you? Do you feel like this hatred for being told what to do is kind of one of the most defining things about you? Is your life somewhat ruled by trying to avoid being told what to do? Were you called bossy as a child, particularly around people who you were comfortable with? Were you unable to handle being told no as a child, and maybe still as an adult a little bit? Have you sometimes felt like you're too social to be autistic, or you don't quite fit the stereotype? If you say yes to all these things and you are autistic, or you suspect you might be autistic, or you haven't thought about whether you could be autistic or not, but you're a detail-focused perfectionist who has a weird sensory experience, who gets stuck into doing things that they're passionate about and just cannot pull themselves away, hate transitioning, hate being interrupted, and you also have struggled with social stuff, then you could be autistic, and you could have something called pathological demand avoidance, sometimes called pathological demand avoidance syndrome. I apologize, it is a terrible name. At some point I'm going to make a whole video ranting about how much I hate this name, because otherwise this whole video will become a rant about how much I hate this name. But like, pathological, did we have to put that in there? Because it might be accurate to some extent if you look at the definition, but like, everyone just thinks of pathological liar, it's negative. Although when I was first looking into autism and I stumbled across pathological demand avoidance, the moment I heard that name, I was like, yeah, that kind of resonates. So I will admit that. However, then I heard that some PDAs prefer to say pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent drive for autonomy, and that fit more. That feels more in tune with like the internal experience of what it's like for the individual, rather than, you know, what people might see on the outside. So PDA, which is a dumb acronym because it's already an acronym for something else, it's secondhand, but you know, it's fine. We won't talk about that. I said we weren't going to complain about the name. It's widely recognized as a profile of autism. PDA is often described as an anxiety-driven need to remain in control. I also think a good way to think about it is extreme performance anxiety that can extend to pretty basic everyday tasks. It's like a claustrophobia kind of feeling that comes from expectation, and the more that you feel is expected of you, the worse it is. And they can be self-imposed expectations as well. So yeah, it's a fun ride. When I say anxiety-driven need to remain in control, it's important to understand what anxiety actually is, because I don't think I really knew, and luckily I found this amazing video by Purple Ella. I thought I was depressed, or I had something called dysthymia, which is like you live with low-level depression every day, because I would feel this sense of heaviness, this sense of impending doom, this feeling like I didn't want to get out of bed because the weight of the day was just so heavy, and I was like, depression. I knew I kind of did have almost like panic attack sort of little episodes that would happen sometimes in very high stress situations. I don't know, it wasn't really, when I heard people talking about I have anxiety, I didn't feel like I wanted to say, yeah, me too, which seems a bit ironic now, but there you go. Like, sometimes we feel very self-aware and we're just not. Some research suggests that an underpinning factor of this demand avoidance might be intolerance of uncertainty, which we know is a thing autistic people don't really like. If you're super afraid that something's gonna go wrong, maybe you'd rather just not do anything. And this makes me wonder if it's maybe also linked to perfectionism and wanting to get every little thing right. And because we're detail focused, because we're autistic, it can be a little bit over the top sometimes. And maybe the weight of all that, of wanting to know that you're getting every little thing right all the time, just can be so paralyzing and make you just not want to do anything or want to procrastinate and delay. For me personally, perfectionism pops up a lot throughout my life as something that I've had to kind of battle with. And it was the thing that came up in my diagnostic appointment again and again. Oh yeah, that links back to perfectionism. And it is something that I have heard from other PDAs as well. I'm going to give you 10 traits of PDA, but before I do that, it's important to remember that it is a spectrum itself. It's a spectrum within a spectrum. Everyone is different, and some people will have a more externalized presentation and some people will internalize their PDA more. It's similar to ADHD, how some people will be very disruptive as children in classrooms and they're much more likely to be diagnosed because they cause chaos. And then you have next to them the little girl who like daydreams and stares out of the window and fidgets constantly with her hair, and so she doesn't get diagnosed until much later in life. Because yes, demand avoidance can be masked, and there's this amazing graphic from Sally Cat PDA sums up masking as a PDA in employment perfectly. This is how it feels from the inside. So here are the traits. They're quite negative, they're quite deficit based as usual when you look into any of these things. Obviously we're not all bad, like All these traits have to kind of be present from childhood. It's a neurodevelopmental condition, but remember they can kind of ramp up as you get older because demands are obviously going to increase as you got more stuff to do. Number 1, surprisingly, shockingly, demand avoidance. But what does that actually mean, and what does that actually look like, and what does that actually feel like? In order for it to be PDA, demands have to be avoided simply because they are demands. So it can't just be because it's something that you don't like to do, because of course everybody procrastinates things that they don't want to do to some extent. However, you will also avoid things that you don't want to do because those are still demands, and sometimes they can feel even worse because they're even more of a threat to your autonomy than something that you actually do want to do. But it's kind of a defining feature of PDA that you will also avoid things that you love to do, that in theory should be a great opportunity or a great experience to you, just simply because there's that expectation and that pressure there. There'll probably be some level, particularly as a child, of avoiding everyday demands. So this might be like brushing your teeth or making your bed or brushing your hair, getting dressed for school, that kind of thing. I was probably about 7 years old and I realized that even when I had a day off school, which was like the biggest demand in my life, I was still always gonna have to brush my teeth. There was always gonna be expectations and requirements as long as you are alive, and that feeling really sad to me. And I've asked other people if they had similar thoughts and they say no. It's important to remember here that PDAs don't just not do anything ever. I feel like some people read the criteria and they see avoid demands to an extreme extent and they imagine someone who's just sat there like, I don't know, that would be like extreme inertia, you just never move. Like, no, we do stuff, and it's like you maybe have a different tolerance day to day, kind of like the spoon theory of disability, if you've heard of that, where you start the day with a certain number of spoons and then you shower and that might be you spending 1 spoon, and then you make breakfast and there's another spoon. It's like that. So you might on one day be able to handle 10 demands, and then the 10th demand is going to be where things hit the fan, which I will get onto later on. Again, Sally Cat PDA has this great graphic, and there's a video which I'll link in the description where she talks through how demands aren't all created equal, basically. Some demands are going to take less of a toll on us than others. Strangely, maybe ironically, we can be quite driven people, and I think we can be quite harsh with our self-imposed demands sometimes and expect a lot of ourselves. This might be to kind of counteract feelings of laziness that we've had throughout our lives, because we know that we don't want to do stuff that other people see as basic and that we need to do, and that we're told by other people you need to do that. So we get like a little bit of a shouty voice in our head. It's like, no, you must do that. And we become very, very demanding of ourselves. In a way, I think it can bring a sense of relief as well, momentary, fleeting sense of relief to get something ticked off and done. It's like, whew. Because it's a fight or flight response. You feel like the expectation is a danger, and once you've done it, it's like a brief sense of like, but then the next thing will start coming for you, and then you'll be on the run from the lion again, you know? Demands can be implicit, so saying something kind of indirect to a PDA child like, wouldn't it be nice if you cleaned your room, like very loudly and obviously in front of them, is not gonna work unless it is said genuinely without any sort of expectation. And gifts can also be demands, because it's like, you will like this. I think you will like this. I don't mind gifts. I prefer it if people ask me first. I prefer to tell people what to get for me. You know, it's that drive for autonomy thing again. You can also avoid positive things that you've been looking forward to. So for example, when I was younger, I was very into video editing, and I was editing on our old PC, and it was doing the blue screen of death all the time, and I really wanted a Mac. So I was saving up for this Mac, and I'd been saving for ages, and it was clearly going to take me a really long time to get there. And so my parents were like, we'll loan you the money, you can get the Mac now, and then you just slowly pay us back so that you can start editing on it. And then I got this Mac and I left it and didn't open it for weeks, maybe even a month or something. You could kind of say that was like just an autistic need for sameness, but then again, there's the whole thing of PDA is trying to avoid uncertainty maybe. Ooh, I don't know if I want to go there. I don't know if I want to open that can of worms yet, even though the can of worms was the computer that I really, really wanted, and I'm just there using this computer that's crashing all the time. Praise can be a demand as well, because you kind of get a feeling, or at least I do, like, ooh, I've done a good thing. People are going to expect me to do more of this. Can I recreate it? And it's a little bit ominous. But I do really appreciate nice comments on my videos, so don't stop. don't stop leaving me positive comments. comments, please. Being told you can't do something is also a demand. It like reverse, it suddenly makes you really want to do that thing, but like in a kind of like panicked, I must do that now because I've been told I can't. And this can be really stupid small things. Like for example, I went to return something to the supermarket. They told me, we can't give you cash, we have to give you a gift card. And I just felt like, just like horrible inside, and it put me in a bad mood for a couple of hours afterwards, and I had to like smile and be like, that's okay, that's fine. I didn't even care that it was a gift card. I use the shop all the time. It makes no difference whether it was a gift card or actual money. It doesn't matter. These demands give you anxiety, which will then make you at least some of the time avoid doing these things, depending on whether you're masking or internalizing. So if you're in a social situation, like I said, at the shop, you might be able to smile and be like, that's fine, but it kind of builds in the background, it affects your mental health, and maybe then later on in the day when you're in a safe situation, once they come home, they have an outburst, a meltdown. And PDA, often your meltdowns can be triggered by this feeling of being out of control, but it's kind of important to see these as anxiety attacks if you're kind of supporting somebody with PDA, rather than an outburst of anger with like malicious intent or a tantrum or something like that. It is actually them in a state of panic. Number 2, a very key feature of being PDA is that you might use social strategies to avoid demands. What does that actually look like? It means we can be relatively good communicators, perhaps more so than you would expect for an autistic person, and we can negotiate and talk our way out of having to do things sometimes. And that can also be inside, in your own head. You can be very convincing about why you need to sabotage something and tear things down and burn bridges, because like obviously look at all of these reasons why I can't do this thing, when the reality of it is, or at least a large part of it may be, that the expectation is just becoming too much for you. I would go to my dad's house every second weekend. My mom was very, very easygoing, which was ideal. She's just an artist, and she's just, I don't know, a bit of a free spirit. She's a great person. It wasn't like my home life was absolute not a chaos. She was very caring and looked after me very well, but she gave me a lot of freedom and respect, I would say, as my own person, even though I was a child, which is like every PDA's dream. However, at my dad's house, it was a little bit more strict. At home, I hated peas. Obviously, I have a lot of sensory stuff with being autistic, and I was allowed to just eat 5 peas at home. Dinner. Why was I even given peas at this point? Was it worth it? I don't think so. How many calories is 5 peas? Can somebody tell me in the comments? Is it minus calories? Like, what the hell is the point in that? I don't know if she was maybe thinking that maybe if I just have 5 one day, I might build up my tolerance. I'd just be like, hey, today I can pee. At my dad's, I had a big fat portion of peas, and they were like, you need to eat those peas. And so I was like, full on like business negotiation, like, can I eat this many? You said, like, at home I get to only eat 5 peas. Sometimes when those strategies don't work, PDAs can start using other things like threats, which is what I did in that situation. And I was like, I'm gonna go home. If you make me eat more than 5 peas, I'm gonna walk home. And it was like a 40-minute drive away from my mom's house. Anyway, that story gets mentioned every time I see my dad. I don't know what happened in the end. I don't know how many peas I ate. You see, even now when I'm thinking back to it, I'm like, I bet I kind of got my own way. You could also use like social strategies to kind of try and delay the demand. That kind of links into procrastinating. Obviously, that's not necessarily a social strategy, but you can find yourself as a PDA putting things off for a while, and maybe you can recognize in yourself that that kind of is linked to anxiety. Like the idea of doing it just feels like just off, and you're like, no, I'm just gonna do this other thing over here. And sometimes you can actually find yourself doing other demands that you perceive as like less oppressive, I suppose. I can be cleaning my house and I'm like, I don't really feel like dusting this. I'll just go and clean out this massive cupboard in another room instead. And it's like the kind of thing that a normal neurotypical person would procrastinate for years, and I'm there like, let's organize the cupboard. You may use distraction in a social way to try and avoid demands. Sometimes children can be quite disruptive in a classroom setting to kind of prevent the lesson from going forwards. I never would have done that. I just seemed like a quiet, shy little girl who didn't know how to friend. There were little glimmers here and there in school where it kind of popped out a little bit, again at times where my tolerance for demands was maybe a little bit lower, but mostly it was all under the surface. You also might make excuses. Children might say things like, my legs don't work, and children may also use role play as well. So they might I don't know, I've heard things like, I'm a dog and dogs don't have to make their bed and stuff like that. When these social strategies have failed, the switch to panic mode can seem very, very quick. So a child may suddenly shout no or something like that. They may just completely shut down and just not physically be able to get up and do it and just become paralyzed. That's like the freeze response. They may have a meltdown, which is kind of like the fight response. They may run away, which is the flight response. And some individuals may self-harm as well when they're in kind of a meltdown/panic mode, because they just feel so out of control. It feels like everything's just spiraling around you and nothing is ever going to be okay again, and there's nothing you can do about it, and your life is over. Number 3, PDAs can appear more social but lack depth in understanding. When I read that, I'm like, you lack depth in understanding. Like, what do you mean by that? So this is kind of where the whole like atypical autism thing comes in. Like, your struggles with social situations can be less obvious and you may be more likely to mask as well. So this is a quote from the PDA Society, and it's specifically in the context of if you were a professional assessing somebody for PDA and kind of what you might want to look out for. They may appear superficially socially very able. However, with time, social communication difficulties become more apparent, and it often becomes clear that sociability cannot be maintained. Mannerisms and gestures may appear over-exaggerated or copied. I feel attacked. Particularly when you're thinking about children, we can often be quite good with words ourselves, but then that kind of covers up how we struggle to process the words of other people. So I remember asking my mum, like, did I used to respond to you as a child? Did I ever just completely ignore you? And she was like, no, I don't think you did. And I got my home video, and do I ever respond to a single thing that she says to me? I'm not sure. Which is just such a contrast to my son, because he would just always respond straight away. And I was speaking to my dad the other day, and he said there were lots of times where I thought you were just being rude, because I would ask you something and you just wouldn't say anything back. Like, maybe you're just very transfixed in what you're doing and you're not able to process that question, or it takes a while for you to process that question, and by the time you do, the person's already moved on and given up on you, or the question is a demand and you're just like, I'd just rather carry on doing what I'm doing. I'm just gonna pretend that you didn't say anything. The PDA Society also says that PDA children often see themselves as adults. So we have like a disregard, a lack of respect for hierarchy, I suppose, and authority. We kind of feel like everybody should be treated equally. This was certainly true for me. I would sometimes, you know, like autistic people, we can have that strong sense of justice, and I would certainly feel that about the way that adults would sometimes treat children and kind of like speak about children as if they weren't in the room. And then PDAs can kind of seek to equalize situations where there is kind of a power imbalance. I mean, it can be good sometimes. I'm not afraid to like advocate for myself when I'm seeing a doctor or something like that. It's not like I'm disrespectful to them. Yeah, it's like we can appear very polite on a surface level, but like inside we've got this like rebellious, like anarchist sort of streak there. PDAs seem to be quite good at masking autism, which I have a few videos about, basically covering up the fact that you're autistic and copying other people's mannerisms and trying really hard to look like everybody else, which can be exhausting. PDAs can seem very charming or even extroverted. I have been referred to as an extrovert several times in my life. I am the most introverted person ever, and every time it has been a massive shock, and I don't really know why. And then there are also people who've said, oh my gosh, you're so shy, it's so cute. I don't know. So like, I get like both sides of it. I don't know how to feel. Nobody really knows what box to put me in, I suppose. I can be quite confident if I'm in a situation where I feel very in control, I know what I'm doing, I'm given freedom. There was a time where I was on some awful, painful, I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to go on a school trip, but I went on this school trip for a few nights in year 7, which is never something I'd usually do. It was hell. I hated it. But the best part was when, for some reason, I was chosen as a team leader for some little activity we had to do in a classroom, and I was like, yes, I'm the leader, because I never got chosen for things like that because people always thought I was so shy and quiet, and I was having a great time delegating to everyone, which is a very PDA thing, that you quite enjoy to do that because you feel like very, I'm in control of the situation, you know, like I can ask them to do that and then you can do that, and it's a nice calming, relaxing feeling to be in that role. And I don't know, I just came out of myself, and the teacher was like, oh, you're not really that shy after all. And this kind of links into the fact that PDA children can be quite controlling in their play with other children. This is not manipulative, it's not malicious in some way, it's an attempt to manage their own anxiety. It's kind of almost like how cleaning your house can be kind of soothing. Like if your house is in chaos and everything's all over the place, it can, particularly as an autistic person, make you feel very unsettled and overwhelmed. But when when that house is clean and everything is in order, it's like, like a deep breath. It's kind of like, I don't know, like you're tidying up the plate almost. Like, okay, you do this role, I think you should do that, you'd be good at that, and okay, maybe if you could do that, and then like if people go, no, I'm not going to do that, it's like, ooh, it's a way to kind of keep our world in order and prevent chaos and uncertainty potentially. Number 4, you may have had a language delay. My parents probably wouldn't have said I had any sort of language delay and like nothing was diagnosed when I was a child, but as I say, I often don't reply to my mum. It could be that PDAs just don't feel like speaking and then they have like this sudden catch up that happens very quickly, and this could be because we like to use social strategies to avoid demands and we realize that it's actually beneficial for us to use our language skills and speak to people because then it can maybe help us to preserve our autonomy. Number 5, mood swings and impulsivity. So there does tend to be quite a lot of crossover between ADHD and someone who's just autistic and ADHD and PDA as well. I'm not too sure where all these things end and another begins, and it's all a little bit confusing. I personally do have an ADHD diagnosis and I know many other PDAs do as well. But yeah, impulsivity and problems with emotional regulation are a thing with ADHD. So the reason why it seems like you have mood swings is because you can switch very quickly into that panic mode, into that fight or flight, or it seems very quick from the outside. For you, there has been a build-up slowly over time. I mean, it can be difficult to recognize that that build-up is happening, and sometimes even for the person, it can feel like a very quick switch, because I think we get used to disregarding our own discomfort. Because if you have PDA, getting out of bed in the morning is heavy. It's difficult to do. So all day you're fighting against that. So how do you know when it's too much? It can seem a little bit like, oh, you were fine and now you're not fine. Like, what's going on there to someone on the outside? During meltdowns, there can be impulsivity because your logic is just kind of suspended. Your body is like just pumping out adrenaline. They might be more contained in adulthood, but still present. So children are more likely to have bigger, more explosive meltdowns, and teenagers as well. Meltdown doesn't have to be like anger. It can be crying and shaking on the floor and kind of rocking back and forth and hyperventilating. It's just your brain just gets completely overwhelmed and just cannot cope anymore. It's like our tolerance for stress is just pretty low, which is hard because we live in a pretty stressful society where everyone kind of struggles with the amount of stress we have. So like, how are we actually supposed to cope? I don't know. It's very, very hard to find appropriate accommodations for that. Number 6, the PDA Society think we can have obsessive behavior, which is often focused on other people. Oh, that kind of makes me cringe. It's like, yeah, okay, that's kind of true, but then you'd have to see all autistic special interests as obsessions too, which it kind of does. It says that, you know, PDAs often can have very intense interests, and these can be atypical interests. I don't know, an obsession with people just sounds like a stalker. That's all I get into my mind is stalking. No, it's just like you have special interests as an autistic person. You sometimes have special people. You maybe don't have as much room in your brain for lots of different friendships the way other people do. So you have a few and you really, really cherish those. I don't really see anything wrong with that as long as you are kind and respectful to those people and understand that they are their own people and they may also want some autonomy in their life. Some children might be obsessed by a friend or sibling, so they might want to spend loads of time with them, really, really attached to them, can maybe be a little bit clingy. It's often said about autistic women that they may have interests that are more social in nature, and this can also be true for PDAs. I mean, I do have an interest, I'd say, in people in general throughout my life, an interest in psychology. You can also get an interest in a specific celebrity as well. I don't know if I've ever had a special interest in a celebrity, maybe Taylor Swift a little bit. I remember a few years ago I read Kazuo Ishiguro for the first time, and then I had to read every single book that he'd ever written because I can get really stuck on one particular writer's voice, and then I find it really hard to pivot and read someone else's books. And then because I just really loved his stuff, I wanted to watch interviews with him, learn more about what he was like as a person, and I found that he was really intelligent and I really enjoyed listening to what he had to say. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I can go down a bit of a rabbit hole of enjoying listening to one person's voice. I just try and find everything they've done and listen to all of it, but I don't have a special interest in him, but like, I suppose for a little while I had a bit of a hyperfixation. Number 7, you may be comfortable in role play or pretend. This is apparently not essential. This was a pretty big feature in my life. Some PDAs may pretend to be another person, may pretend to be an animal. I didn't, but I've always been a person who's quite enjoyed doing creative things and had quite a vivid imagination. My play was very weird as a child. It wasn't like typical play, but it wasn't typical autistic play either. I don't think, as far as I know, I don't have any video or photo of it, I don't think I lined things up. My play was mostly me like flapping my hands and kind of like rocking back and forth in like front of a doll's house or something, say, and I'd have set up a scene of dolls, and then I would imagine what they were doing and what they were saying to each other, and it would be really vivid for me, and then I'd like maybe move them into the next room and then carry on. And so I would barely touch my toys and they would stay in quite a nice condition because of that, which I liked. So it says on the PDA Society that play can appear imaginative but tends to be based on things they've seen, like such as on TV. I take issue with that a little bit because, I mean, there's a book called Steal Like an Artist. Isn't this a whole thing that everything's a remix? There are new ideas. Everything is based on something. This just kind of linked to the stereotype that autistic people can't be creative at all. I think maybe because I've always seen myself as quite an imaginative person, I just kind of take offense to that a little bit. I'm like, I suppose so, but like all children play house and they might play shops. You know, it's all based on things that they've seen. Like, what is this pinnacle amazing creativity, neurotypical imagination? My mom is an artist. She's amazing. She's definitely very, very creative, but she uses reference photos for all of her sculpting. She doesn't pull things out of her bum. At nursery, I didn't play with other children. I used to flap my hands and walk around the playground in a circle, and I would imagine the children that I could see in stories. Like, I'd watch them and I'd be like, okay, that person is called this, and I'd come up with a name for them because I didn't actually know because I'd never spoken to them, and I'd imagine what their career would be one day or something like that. And that was how I got myself through the playtimes. Number 8. You may find yourself more able to do something as a PDA if there is novelty involved, which again kind of maybe links to this ADHD component. You made a decision, I'm gonna do this is exciting, I'm taking control, I'm on a path, and then as soon as you know you've been doing it for a few days, it's routine, you're like, but maybe I want to do something else over there, and then there's like panic and claustrophobia that kind of sets in and you're less able to tolerate it. This can be for jobs for sure. Like, I strangely quite enjoy the process of applying for a job, going through an interview and masking your way through an interview and then starting the job for about the first 5 minutes, and then I'm like, so you feel like an initial sense of empowerment because you've made a decision, but then you kind of get engulfed by the expectation. Number 9, you may have had issues with employment or school avoidance. I think jobs are kind of worse than school, even though school is bad for PDAs, and many PDAs will completely just avoid school and you will not be able to get them out of the door. I would go through phases where my attendance would be not great. I was late almost every day. I would fake illnesses to come home. It was a struggle. I hated it. Luckily, my mom sometimes could see that I did not have the capacity to go and would let me kind of have a rest day, but sometimes she would feel really desperate and like she just didn't know how to get me to go back. And it would be like sometimes the more days I took off, the less I could cope with the expectation of needing to go back, and then I would just postpone, and eventually I would force myself to go back. But with jobs, I think it can feel even worse because you're being paid, and that feels threatening in a way, like, I will give you this money, but only if every single day between this time and this time you come here and you do this, and it just feels claustrophobic. In school, you can kind of, you know, just zone out if you want to and put in minimal effort, and you don't always have to be putting yourself forward and, you know, be super enthusiastic, whereas in work, you're kind of expected to network and look like you want to be there, and, you know, it's a little bit more effort that has to be put into how you come across depending on what job you do. It's quite a common thing that PDAs are like a completely different person at school to how they are at home. Like, you might hear that your child is super well behaved, but then once they get home, they can be a little bit explosive, and it could be the same for an adult at work as well. You might hold it all in at work, be like super friendly, everyone thinks you're, you know, super sociable, maybe you're even extroverted, and then you get home and you're like shut down, like can't handle things anymore, can't socialize, you have nothing left to give to your family, which is sad. Masking doesn't mean that you've found a way to overcome it. It doesn't mean the demand avoidance or the anxiety has gone away. And you're not even pushing it down, it's just there. You're just pretending that it's not there to anyone around you, trying to make sure you look like you're okay when you feel distressed. Number 10, your parents may have been kind of judged by other parents, by teachers. They may have been told that they're giving you too much freedom, that their parenting is too unconventional. They just need to give you a little bit more discipline and that'll sort you right out kind of thing. Obviously, this one depends on you having parents who kind of understood your support needs and understood that freedom was important to your mental health. In some cases, parents may have even been investigated for fabricated or induced illness. So that's fun. All right, so you might be PDA. Now what? What do you need to do? Should you get a diagnosis? Well, you can't really get a diagnosis of PDA. Well, you can, but you might not want to, but like, yeah, what is all that? If you're already diagnosed with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, it's, as I said, the spectrum within the spectrum. It's widely recognized as a profile of autism, so you're kind of already diagnosed. You're on the spectrum. This is on the spectrum. It's all spectrum-y. At this time, it's not a standalone diagnostic label. Before I got my diagnosis, I did actually message the place where I was diagnosed and I asked them about PDA, and this is what they said. If the clinician observes traits of PDA throughout the assessment, they may word the diagnosis as autism spectrum disorder with a demand avoidant profile, for example. The clinician will discuss with the family the pros and cons of this wording as part of the diagnosis, for example, possible implications on employment. So yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to the whole thing that the name stinks. Like, hello, please let me work for your company. I have pathological demand avoidance. Like, again, thanks for the name. Much appreciated. It says nothing about anxiety in it. It doesn't tell you what it is. It just makes you sound like a bit of an idiot who doesn't want to do anything, you know? Or a little bit antisocial, which, I don't know, maybe we are. I don't think we're that. Diagnosis aside, how do you cope? How do you live? I mean, that's a whole other topic that I can cover in future videos. But briefly, I mean, the typical accommodations for autism, like having a kind of rigid routine that'll make them feel safe, that will not work for a PDA, you know, like the color-coded visual timetable. No, it doesn't work. How do I manage to get stuff done? I give myself as much freedom as possible. I work for myself, so my demands are largely self-imposed. I give myself a to-do list at the start of the day. I write it. I pretty much never look at it, but just the act of writing it kind of reminds me of what I have to do, and then I do everything in completely the wrong order. I remember as a teenager many times printing out a schedule for myself and being like, right, you are now going to do this, and for every morning you're going to sit at your desk and you're going to write your novel for 2 hours, and it was really, really intense. I was quite an intense person, but I just felt awful. I just felt awful. I realized very quickly that was not going to work for my mental health. I felt super guilty and chaotic and disorganized for that, but like, whatever. I live in like organized chaos. A few other things that might help. If someone can help me in just like a tiny way, like say I'm doing an essay on my computer or something, and I might say to my husband, can you bring me my charger? I'm perfectly capable of getting the charger myself. Obviously that is a demand, but also just him getting the charger, it's like, it's not, you know, me alone against the world. Look, there's someone who cares and he's offering his support, kind of making people aware of how much those little bits of support can help you. Think about how you can increase the freedom and flexibility in your life. That's always going to help. Reducing demands is great. Like, I had a stressful week and I had a hospital appointment that, you know, it's not urgent, but it's, you know, it would have been good to do it like at that time, but I rescheduled it because I was like, nah, I don't want to do that this week. I also sometimes find that doing things, if there's a deadline sort of demand, doing it early can make you feel super in control and like, haha, you said this had to be done for this day, but look, I did it 2 weeks early. What? It can feel a little bit rebellious in a strange way. It's a little bit like with the to-do list. Like, I know I said I was gonna do invoices in the morning, but look, I did 2 hours of video editing. What? You know, like, you can kind of trick yourself a little bit with that. Also, like mindfulness and meditation, that can be another demand in your schedule that you might not need and might kind of conflict with the whole reducing demands thing. But I think because our nervous systems are so overactive, it can be helpful. I quite like body scan kind of meditations. I think that can be quite nice and relaxing, but like, do I meditate every day? I can't remember the last time I meditated, you know. I think also just trying to manage your own perfectionism as well, because my pattern through life at the moment, which I'm hopefully going to be able to counteract now I have a diagnosis, has been put a whole lot of pressure on myself, impose loads and loads of demands, be super perfectionist until I get to a point where I'm completely burnt out and I never want to do that thing again, and I just tear down and sabotage everything I've done and then start afresh and then start going over the top on something something else, you know? Autonomy is important to everybody and freedom is important to everybody. It improves everybody's quality of life for sure, but for PDAs, it's just that next level. I've been talking a lot about autistic masking. If you don't really know what that is, I have a video here which I'll leave linked, which is all about how autistic masking actually feels from the inside. Bye.